Hey, those who are here. I see a couple of the panelists who are here. So I just wanted to say hi, I'm Andra, I'm going to chair. Today we'll try to keep it to the 8 minutes if everybody shows up, but I wanted to ask if you have any preferences about the order in which you present. Hey, Christine.
I don't mind going, or we can go in the order of the program.
Okay, is that okay with you, Denise? I'm reading your lips. Sorry.
I had sent an email to Tiffany, I think, asking her how much time we had. I didn't get a reply, so I did not know it was 8 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where I would have seen that, but I didn't see that. I'm sorry. But so I'm a little more than. Let me go last then, because I was
then.
time.
That's fine. If somebody drops out, there'll be a cushion. But the panels themselves are only 1 hour long, and so that's why it's been truncated to give people time to reply.
Where would I have seen that, Andra? Where did I miss that? The 8 minutes.
Honestly, I'm just going on the norm of my own panel that just went a couple of minutes ago. So I probably should have been more up on just telling people that ahead of time.
Because I'm used to 15 minutes. So
I know. I totally, but just with the hour long as opposed to the hour 45 panels.
So let me go last so I can cut back on what I'm going to say.
Sure.
I'm going to revise really quickly what I'm going to say. Okay, thank you so much.
Are the panels usually longer? Is this the first time?
They're usually an hour 45. If we were in person, we'd be going an hour and a half.
Okay.
At least.
Just making sure.
All right. Awesome. Okay, based on sort of who we have, I only see 2 speakers right now. So Christine, if you don't mind going first. And then Denise. And so because of that, if you can take a little bit longer. Now, if somebody else shows up, I might have to ask you to like carry back a little bit.
Do you want to give them like 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Okay. That's you, Tiffany? Yeah.
No, this is Christine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you sounded an awful lot like Tiffany, like right.
That's a compliment.
It's not.
You.
It's not.
Thank you. I'll take it. Tiffany Willoughby Harrod, right?
Yeah.
You've made my day.
Sure.
What panel did you just leave?
Voter supply. It was the one that Alexandria was on.
Oh.
Okay, we're just going to give people 1 more minute just to see if anybody else will join us.
I know Sharon Austin is in Paris.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm from Emory University. I'm going to be the chair of, and I guess the de facto discussant of today's panel. So we have 2 great panelists who are here, who are ready to present. I will start with the first panelist, and so that's Dr. Christine Slaughter of Princeton University, soon to be Boston University. So I will let her have the floor. Feel free to give yourself 12 minutes.
everybody. I will be presenting some descriptive work that I've done looking at the role of the racial wealth gap on the political participation of millennials. So this has been a project that I've had in a file for a while, and I'm hoping to get it out soon. So I appreciate your comments, as I should have a working paper in the very near future. So first is thinking about economic inequality and how it pertains to millennials. This is a 2017 report from Gen Forward. And looking across the four major racial and ethnic groups in the United States, we can see that millennials, that is individuals aged between 18 and 36, report financial circumstances that are less than optimal. So for instance, at this first column, this first panel, where the outcome is I spend more than I make, we see that over 29% of African Americans in the survey reporting that they're spending more money than they're making. And that's not far off from Asian Americans, Latinos, and whites. And also we can see in this other column here, where it's no income, on the far right side, that over 13% of millennials report not having income, and also 15% of Asian Americans and 9% of Latinos. And then thinking about financial assistance from family for millennials, another predicament is African Americans, again, in this leftmost column. If they were faced with an unexpected bill of $1,000, 38% of African Americans report that they're not able to pay. And that's relatively low compared to Asian Americans, Latinos, and whites. So just thinking about how millennials themselves are facing financial hardships in their transition to adulthood, and also different forms of resources are less available to millennials, such as financial assistance from their families. So let's begin to consider questions around how does familial wealth, so it is thinking about what parents are able to transmit to their children, impacts the political behavior of the children. So what's important, and I say children because these are 18 to 36-year-olds, but not necessarily youth. So more appropriate will be young adults. Thinking about the racial wealth gap and its origins, we know that Black Americans were largely denied the ability to build wealth and own property and pass it to their families. And we also know these are still inequalities that African Americans face, both in employment and their opportunities to accrue capital. And we know the wealth gap is extreme, and some estimates earmark that Black Americans only hold 2.9% of wealth of United States household wealth. And just to be sure we're on the same page, when I speak of wealth, I'm speaking of the dollar amount of assets, including home equity minus the total amount of debt to get net worth. And this is a value that could be both positive and negative. So then thinking back to the predicament of millennials, we know this is a generation born in 1981 to 1996. And on numerous economic indicators, they lag behind previous generations. And also we know even Black millennials that aspire upward mobility, about 80% of them have some form of student loan debt compared to half of white millennials. And also millennials are coming of age in the period of the economic recession. And this is to factoring into their ability to build wealth and other economic opportunities. So overall, if we think about millennials having less access to economic opportunities, less racial wealth gaps among Black Americans and white Americans, thinking about the political participation of millennials, that is young adults, we know that young adults are less participatory than older adults. And because voting is a habit-forming activity, early political participation is important to continued activity over the life course. So kind of what I expect might be going on is that wealth and access to formal and informal resources are shaping the lived experiences of young adults. And this economic status has been transmitted from parents, has impact on millennials' participation in electoral politics. And primarily because we see racial differences in net worth, we should see racial difference, well, not we should, but there is an expectation that there are also racial differences in participation. So wealthy Americans with higher incomes are likely more participatory than those with lower incomes. And we know these individuals vote more, discuss politics more, and participate in a range of elected activities more. So if we think about some of the consequences of the wealth gap, that millennials from more wealthy backgrounds will have more time, civic experience, and indeed more money to participate in politics than their less wealthy peers. And we may expect there's some differences that either mitigate or exacerbate the wealth gap between different racial groups. So for instance, we may expect that group identity is important for African Americans to overcome the socioeconomic barriers to participation. And this is a consistent finding within the literature on socioeconomic status, that individuals, African Americans, may have a lower socioeconomic status, but because of their racial group consciousness, they're more participatory in political acts. But then thinking of factors that may exacerbate the influence of the wealth gap, we may see things such as region and individual income status, tempering the extent to which parental wealth matters for young adults. So the way that I try to get at this question, kind of beyond having tax records to look at earnings among different families, but also having a longitudinal way to assess wealth transfers, again, because wealth is sticky. So this is something that it's not just easily accrued, it's accrued over time. I look to the panel study of income dynamics, and the panel study of income dynamics is the longest going household panel in the United States of American families. So it started in 1968 to assess the extent to which poverty and other economic indicators were either lessening or growing because of recent social progress. We think about, well, where I'm able to assess the voting behavior of millennials is a supplement that the PSID does for young adults raised in PSID households. So in this extent, I'm able to observe individual voting behavior over time. So it's a longer period that I have access to, and I'm going to show the results for 2008 and 2012, because there I'm able to look at the same set of individuals over time. Observations, so these will be 18 to 27-year-olds. And then again, this is at 2008 and 2012. And they are the children of PSID panel participants. So the wealth measures are drawn from the main panel, and the behavioral measures are drawn from the supplemental panel. So the question is, the outcome measure is just, did you vote in the national election for president? And unfortunately, because it isn't a political survey, it's widely used by economists, demographers, and sociologists. A lot of the measures that we appreciate in political science, such as registration status or party ID, those aren't available in the PSID. So there are some limitations with examining this data, but because I'm able to have measures of wealth, which aren't available in other surveys, I believe it's most appropriate to answer this question. And my intention is not to make any causal claims around access to greater resources, but more so to just look at associations that are present to see what follow-up studies could be done. And then the approach, I'll show both marginal effects of different variables and the predicted probability of moving from the lowest to the highest wealth quartile. So it's important to discuss how I am measuring wealth. So in 3 years, the PSID did a deep dive into family assets and holdings. So this is a measure that was constructed in 3 separate ways in 1984, 2003, and 2013. And wealth is constructed as a sum of 6 asset types minus the amount of debt plus the value of the home equity. And it is the case that familial net worth can be negative if debts exceed the total assets. For ease of interpretation, again, understanding that this is a variable that ranges greatly over the course of 3 racial and ethnic groups, I use quartiles. So you'll see that in the next slide. So I'm just showing the median values in the 4 quartiles that I generated from this wealth measure. That's a raw income measure. So in future studies, it will be best to log this variable to kind of be able to capture the tail ends in terms of individuals having negative wealth versus assessing well into the millions. So just looking at the differences between 1984, 2001, and 2013, again, recognizing these aren't necessarily perfect measures of time distancing between when this wealth measure is calculated. But we can see overall that African Americans and Latinos have a lower median wealth value compared to white Americans. And then we can see that persists in 2001 and 2013. So overall, the median wealth of white families is higher than the median wealth of Black and Latino families, but this is something that's consistent throughout most economic studies. So again, my expectations are that we should see differences between Black, Latino, and white wealth-rich young adults, and we should see them participating in elections to a greater extent than those that are wealth-poor. So here I'm going to look at the 2018 election. So Black Americans are in the red, Latinos are in the green, and white Americans are in the blue. And there is some preliminary evidence for my expectation that the racial wealth gap is present in terms of how it impacts political participation. So again, we can see the distance between the lowest quartile for Black Americans is above that of white Americans, and we can also see that on the right end of the distribution. And again, we see a similar pattern in 2012. And this is also the case that Black Americans, wealthier Black Americans are more participatory than less wealthy Black Americans, but also we can see that the slope for Black Americans is higher than that for Latinos and whites. So that's like some evidence to marshal that this gap is impacting the extent to which individuals have resources and they're able to use those resources to participate. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over those set of results. So basically, I'm looking to see if there are any differences between having higher racial identity versus higher or living in a particular region as it pertains to voting. And we do see those factors matter some, but still this wealth quartile overall is doing a great amount of work in terms of understanding participation. So overall, just to summarize, Millennials is not a monolithic experience. And also as we think about this group and as they age into participation, we should also consider alternative sources of financial resources and their impact on behavior, and recognize that the access to resources vary across race and not just captured in income. So what I want to do next is look at the 2016 presidential election and also toss in the role of individual income to see if there are differences between wealth-rich and income poor versus income poor and wealth-rich individuals. So thank you everybody for your time, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you very much for this paper, Christine. Our next paper is from Denise Quinlan of the University of Florida.
Thank you so much. Let me get this set up. Share screen. Well, let me not, well, let's see where we are here. Share. And do this and do that. Okay, what can you see? Is that okay?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, all right, so let's get started. Thank you so much. My name is Denise Quinlan. I'm a third-year student at the University of Florida, and my research area of interest is income inequality, economic disparities, and the intersection of business and politics, and how that intersection impacts economic disparities and contributes to income inequality. The title of my paper is called The Political Economy of Foreign Investments in Local Communities. And I always love to start with a good quote. And APSA back in 2002 said that the historic accomplishments of the 1960s rights revolution may not be jeopardized by continuing economic and political inequalities. Let me move this subject away. Which is a great quote. I followed up with a second quote, which I also like very much. What government does not do is just as important as what it does. And this is APSA looking at inequality back in 2002. So inequality is a problem. And by means of background, the primary means of wealth accumulation, as we know, is home ownership and business ownership. And as we also know, there has been systemic institutional racial bias that has affected Black home values, Black home ownership, and Black business ownership. Racial bias has also contributed to young Black men being deprived of career opportunities and has also contributed to the wealth gap between the races. The issues that continue to hurt us today include discrimination in hiring, inequitable pay. Black men make 73 cents on every dollar that white men make for the same work. Black women make 63 cents on every dollar that white men make for the same work. Student loans are offered at high rates to Black students. Tax laws protect white wealth through tax cuts and loopholes, and that's transferred to tax havens offshore. Median white income is twice as much as the median Black income. Median white net worth is more than twice as much as that of the Black net worth, and median white home ownership is 73%, while it is 45% for Black homeowners. I've got a few graphs that show the disparities that I'm interested in examining. There's just home ownership disparities. This graph shows the stark disparity between Black home ownership and white home ownership. For example, hiring disparities at any education level that we look at, we are able to see that there are disparities in hiring between Blacks and white, whether they are high school diplomas or degrees. There's still very stark disparities. Looking at the wealth gap between Black females and other females, white and other, the gap is quite stark. Well, what this is showing is that if we reduce the gap, it actually contributes to the economy. So this is a very important graph that shows that if government would enact policies that try to reduce the wealth gap, it actually does help the economy and economic growth. Wage disparities in Georgia, and my focus, my dissertation is going to focus on Georgia. And this is the first part of my dissertation that's going to examine the disparities that exist in Georgia. This shows the wage disparities in Georgia, the income inequality gap, the income disparity between the richest and the poorest 20%. You can see the stark contrast in the income gap in Georgia. Employment disparities, same thing, gap, quite stark gaps in disparities. There's an unemployment disparity, and it's just, I've got several graphs just to show what we are going to work toward understanding how business and politics contributes to these disparities. Underemployment among Black Georgians is much higher than white unemployment, for example. When it comes to taxes, taxes are an integral part of disparities because whenever there's a tax cut, a substantial part of the state's wealth and the nation's wealth is transferred upward to the top 1%, top 20, top 5%, and that sort of thing, so that it is important to understand the role that taxes play. And there's also disparities in tax payments. We've talked about the employment disparities. We've talked about employment disparities. There's so many ways to slice and dice the disparities. More income inequality, and I wanted to talk about taxes because taxes are something that we don't look at very often. What this shows is that tax breaks benefit the top 20% significantly, and whenever there's a tax cut, tax breaks, tax abatements, it is the very wealthy that benefits substantially more than the average worker. This shows the same thing in Georgia and Savannah, for example, when there are tax changes, the tax benefits accrue to the top 20% substantially more than they accrue to average workers in Georgia. So these are the personal taxable revenues. What this shows is that corporations in Georgia pay a very small amount of taxes, and the gap between the taxes that the Georgia corporations pay and Georgia individuals pay is quite stark. It's a very, very dramatic difference in corporate tax payments versus personal tax payments. This again shows the same thing, that corporations pay a very small part of the annual revenue in Georgia compared to the tax payments of individuals and sales taxes. So the question is, okay, so how did we get here? Where did all of this disparity come from? What's contributing to it, and how can it be addressed? So in Georgia, the Georgia Department of Economic Development, they've earned $11 billion in foreign investments over the past, as a fiscal year end June 2021, creating 34,000 new jobs, an increase of 46% over the previous year, and that's fantastic. The question is, who is getting these jobs? And you'll see that Georgia has billions of dollars in revenue for foreign investments every year, and it's quite impressive. They do a fantastic job, but who is benefiting from these investments is my research area. Georgia state revenue increased by 14%, with the state budget surplus increasing to over $4 billion. So the state has a budget surplus even, and so that's fantastic. But how are Black Americans, how are Black Georgians benefiting from this surplus and these enormous revenues that the state collects? Statistical data suggests that Georgia's growth is inequitable, with its minority residents not having equal access to the benefits of Georgia's investments in foreign businesses. And this is my area of interest. How are Black Americans benefiting and enjoying the windfalls of these foreign investments that are coming into Georgia every year? This shows the foreign direct investments in Georgia. It shows the top 10 countries. And you can see that the UK and Germany and Canada, billions of dollars invested in Georgia. It shows the top countries. It shows the top countries by employment and by investment. And what it shows is that there's substantial foreign investment in Georgia, and it increases every year. It also, what this graph also shows is that a lot of money, I mean, the bottom line here is for fiscal year 2022, $6 billion is going to be transferred to corporations in tax abatements, tax credits, tax incentives. If you look at the Georgia Department of Economic Development website, it describes the enormous tax advantages that corporations have, the tax benefits they're given to attract them to come to Georgia, and that's wonderful, except for the fact that that's money that's taken away from the average taxpayer in Georgia, and the benefits are being transferred to corporations in Georgia. So the question is, okay, what's the public policy process for determining how much of Georgia's wealth is transferred to corporations, transferred to the upper class, to the top 1%, while it's so difficult to give a $500 tax credit to the poor? So what's that public policy process? How does that influence work so that corporations can get billions of dollars in benefits and pay hardly any taxes, while the average worker pays more than many corporations pay in Georgia? And that's my area of interest. How does that happen? How is that equitable? And how do we try to address this inequitable growth that appears to be occurring in Georgia? This shows jobs created by FDI, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the darker colors show that Georgia and Florida have received substantial jobs from foreign direct investments. And that's why I'm looking at Florida, and I will also look at Georgia. That's why I'm looking at Georgia and Florida, but first Georgia, because Georgia and Florida receive the greatest amounts of foreign investments in the region, in this region. What this shows is that the increase, the steady increase in foreign direct investments in the US, and that's a lot of trillions of dollars in revenues coming to the US in foreign investments. How are African Americans benefiting? How are the average workers in Georgia benefiting from the investments coming into the state and into local communities? And so my research questions are, to what extent do foreign investments contribute to economic disparities, and how do foreign investments affect the behavior of our state representatives and expenditures? As part of my research, I love Gillen's. If you ever read anything Gillen's has written, he also studies inequality and democratic responsiveness. And because the fact of the matter is, economic inequality leads to political inequality. And that's why economic inequality is so important, because all of the studies show, lots of studies Gillespie has done, shows that the rich have far greater influence in public policy making than the poor. That's just, many studies have shown that. And that's why it's important to address economic disparities, because the economic disparities lead to political disparities. And in this democracy, that cannot be tolerated. So what Gillespie, in this paper, this 2005 paper by Gillespie, he says representational bias undermines the democratic character of our society. There's a vast discrepancy in government responsiveness to citizens of different incomes. Policy outcomes reflect the preferences of the affluent and bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of the poor and middle income Americans. And that is why income inequality must be addressed. And I think there's a message in the chat, but I don't know if I should look at it, if somebody's going to, let's see, I'm going to keep going and look at them at the end, I think. So this is another Gillespie paper. This is his 2009 paper. It's called Preference Gaps and Inequality in Representation. And again, his studies show that income-based preference gaps are large and widespread. The affluent are far better represented than the poor, and representational inequality has repercussions across a wide range of policy issues. This is his area. Then there's Erickson. They both study income inequality and political responsiveness. And his summary, his findings show that economic mobility in the United States has fallen behind other developed countries. The evidence mounts that the rich get richer at the expense of the middle class and the poor. And that is what some of those graphs that I showed earlier, what they demonstrate, especially the tax advantages that the wealthy have. So much of the economy, so much of the income of the state flows upward, contrary to the general view that maybe redistribution occurs from the rich to the poor, but that is not often the case. Very often the case, each time there's a tax cut, the income is being transferred from the poor to the rich. And this is something that must be addressed and must be made known and investigated. Evidence mounts that the rich get richer at the expense of the middle class, and especially the poor. When policy questions are a matter of rich versus poor, the opinions of the rich are influential beyond their numbers and capable of slowing the pace of reformist laws. So when the rich are in power, then of course they pass laws that serve their purposes and not serve the purposes of the poor. American Political Economy, APE, so my research occurs under the APE umbrella, and American Political Economy seeks to improve understanding of the political and economic processes that affect the lives of the voting public. APE investigates the linkage between economic and political inequality. Political interventions shape the economy, and economic activity and resources shape politics. That is why that intersection is so important. Government policies affect the public's participation in economic development. So it is important to understand economic governance and political governance and how those two things intersect. Political power, under the umbrella of American political economy, the political power resides within corporations and business coalitions. Corporate actors mobilize to influence political and market institutions. Corporations and their allies generate advantages for their stakeholders, not for the poor, but for their stakeholders. Obviously, they have shareholders. And these advantages produce economic disparities that cleave along racial lines. So that interaction between business and politics and the influence that businesses have on politics, they produce economic disparities that cleave along racial lines. And this is my area of interest. So then Figlio and Blon again, they looked at this. This is the effect of foreign direct investments on local communities is just one small part of the way in which businesses affect economic disparities. There's so many other ways, but this is just a small part. And these two are political economists looked at the effects of foreign direct investments on local communities, as I am. So I'm building on their work, actually. And so their findings, they found that foreign investment raises local real wages much more than domestic investment does. They found that FDI lowers per capita county government expenditures, and they found that FDI redistributes money away from public school expenditures. The question is, why is that? So why is it that you're going to have these large multinational corporations coming into a local community, and suddenly the public school expenditures are being reduced? How is that fair?
Can I just interrupt? We have about 25 minutes left. I want to be sure we have time for the discussant comments and audience questions. So would it be possible for you to jump to your main finding and conclude? Thank you.
Yes, let me do that. So let me just go. So we've got all of that information. We've got, let's talk about this. So the data sources to do my research, for example, would be all of the data sources I've got listed there. I won't bother to read them, but those are the areas, those are the data sources I would use. My hypothesis that there's a relationship between foreign plant employment and wage increases. There's a relationship between foreign plant employment and decreases in the public school budgets. And there's a relationship between foreign plant employment and increases in public transportation and public safety budgets. They have discussed the dependent variables we're going to use in the research design. We've got the foreign plant employment variable, the manufacturing employment variables. These are the models I would use to come up with the regression. And the findings that they found were that, yes, there's an impact on wages, and yes, it affects school expenditures, and yes, it affects public transportation, public safety expenditures. And I think that's my last one. So yes, that's it. I can stop right there. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. I am going to spend a couple of minutes. Pardon me, I'm getting ready to sneeze. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you very much. Responding to both of the papers, and then if the speakers have some comments, please feel free to share those, and then I'm going to open it up to audience questions. So I will talk about the papers in the order that they were presented. So first, the Slaughter paper. I will have to say, just from a pedagogical standpoint, I love your descriptive data. I always start off my Black politics class by talking about the reasons why Black people's life chances and political preferences might be different based on those different life chances. And I always use big aggregate data about income and wealth inequalities. But I like the way that the Gen Forward survey breaks things down descriptively by age and on questions that young people would actually care about. So you very much inspired me today to sort of think about framing those issues and those questions in a very different way. So I appreciate that. I love this research topic, and I think the way that you're approaching it is sound. I understand the limitations of the data that you're using. And in fact, as you were speaking, I started to think about other panel survey data that I think ask a little bit more granular political questions along with other things. And I for a second thought it was the PSID. And then I went back and looked and realized that it wasn't. But, you know, I think probably as a way to strengthen the project, your regressions are what they are based on the data set that you have. But what I hope you're going to incorporate into the larger project is a discussion of other things that you might be able to tease out using other pieces of data, perhaps some qualitative data. So I think the big questions that I have in terms of thinking about involvement is thinking about Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, and the idea that Blacks in particular used other things to offset the structural disadvantages that they might have had as a result of poverty, of not having access to education and other types of disadvantage. So the question that I would have is, do we see the same patterns amongst young people today, where they may be using, being involved in student government in high school, or being involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, or the way Verba, Schlossman, and Brady looked at it, being involved in church, like places where you can learn civic skills, even if you didn't even if you weren't taught them in schools. And so are those places where we can see sort of an offset that actually is also equally, if not more, predictive of African-American political participation. But I think you're, off on, on a great track, and I look forward to seeing what how the project unfolds over the next few months and years. As for the Quinlan et al. Paper, there was a lot of description here. And so the research question is certainly an important one. I think many of my critiques have to do with thinking about how to present in this particular context. So in general, one piece of advice that I would give is it takes about a minute to go through each slide. So just pace yourself accordingly. And then also think about the ratio of slides that are your setup in your lit review versus the slides that actually present your findings. So once we got to the findings slides, I would have hoped to have seen regression slides. So the actual tables with coefficients or graphs with point estimates so that I could actually see what the relationships and the patterns were with the data. Because, and I know it's because I was pushing you for time, you went through them quickly, but because it was written in prose, I couldn't actually see what was going on. And that's actually the essence of the presentation. That's actually more important than the lit review. So just just sort of as a reminder, as an encouragement, think about the back end of the presentation and making sure that that's tight and that that's clear and that you're walking people through everything. The same thing goes for your model specifications. So it's great to present your quadratic equation with all of its Greek letters, but what's actually more helpful for the audience is to know what all of the Greek letters stand for, and in particular, what how you're coding your independent and your dependent variables. Because I think the question is definitely of value and of merit. And so I look forward to seeing the fruition of this project later. So I will stop there. And if the panelists have questions or comments or replies to my comments, please feel free to share those now. And then once we're done with that, we will open this up to the audience for questions.
Thank you, Andra, for both the comments and the compliment. I just think it's so important to think about not just income itself, but also like these other factors that are really shaping how Black people engage in the political process. So I'll definitely look to supplement this data kind of now that it's some evidence that there's a there to see where else I can find some resources to bolster that. One direction that I think, I considered going, but abandoned, was thinking about if people are actually, does awareness of this racial wealth gap matter? Just because amassing the data itself, like with the income, wealth measures is difficult kind of within the same context of the participation item. So just thinking if like awareness of the wealth gap itself had some connection to participation, thinking that the awareness of the wealth gap is connected to this discontent with status, and that is what's propelling not propelling, but leading to the participation. So I've looked at like maybe running a pilot to kind of see if that connection could be made, because I think that might be a bit stronger than another data set that will potentially get me some items, but not all. Well, not all, but it can't really connect the string between wealth and participation because it's such a long arrow that needs to be drawn between those two. So I appreciate your comments and I'll figure out the next step now.
Yeah, sure. If I could just add one thing to it. I mean, one way to kind of go about doing this might be focus groups with stratified samples. So it's convenient, but like you had some intentionality, not just in terms of making sure you got like your regional stuff straight, but stratifying the samples where you do groups with high wealth, low wealth, high income, low income people, and just ask them certain questions about, how they get and consume political knowledge. So, there are the survey data. So when I think about this, Jim Gimple, Celeste Lay, they did this book in the mid 2000s on in the DC area, actually, about political conversations among young people. And so, one of the things that people think about, there are the traditional things that can predict voter turnout based on the socioeconomic model. But one of the things that they found was that kids who lived in households where people talked about politics more were more likely to participate as adults. And if I recall the findings correctly, right, that would be one of the things that separate in their study Black respondents from white respondents in particular, was the fact that Black households were talking about politics less. Now, it could be the way they asked the question, sort of didn't capture the way people talk about political conversations, but that's the kind of thing you can get at in a more qualitative sense to see kind of whether or not people are actually thinking about these things in the same way across class strata, and whether or not the difficulties that people sort of face as a result of, trying to like make month and money meet, sort of get them to think about these things differently and get them to sort of like vocalize that I'm going to place a different value on engaging in this type of behavior because my main focus is I got to pay my rent this month, or I got to make sure that I make groceries or other kinds of things.
Hi, thank you so much, Andra. Yes, my presentation was way too long. I gave myself 20 minutes, not knowing it was going to be 8 minutes or 10 minutes. So I definitely did not get to talk about the work, the regressions. And it's very, very simple, actually. The professor that we're building off of, he simply regressed wages against jobs, foreign jobs, foreign plants, foreign manufacturing, the percentage of foreign jobs as compared to total jobs in a county, and regressing that, and then comparing and seeing the relationship between employment in terms of jobs, actual jobs in the community, and increases in wages. My question is going to be looking to see who got those jobs, who is being hired, and who is benefiting from these investments. And same thing with the school budgets. He found that the school budgets were being reduced when these investments came into the community. Suddenly, government budgets that benefit the poor, and he has actually said, especially in low-income neighborhoods, their budgets were being reduced. And so my investigation is going to look into why, if there's so much money coming in, why are public school expenditures going down? So yes, there's a whole lot of that that's going to be explored, and I look forward to sharing that with you at a future date.
Great. I mean, we have a little bit of time. Do you want to go back and reiterate, or just say a little more slowly what your key findings have been so far?
Well, no, well, what I'm showing right now is the work that was done by the professors I'm going to build off of. So this is the first part of my project, and it stops where his work stops, and I will build in the second phase on his work and add my own data, all of the data sources I listed. I'll go digging into those data and seeing how Black people were affected adversely or positively by these investments coming into the communities. So that's going to be in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. All right, so that's it for me. I'd like to open this up to everybody in the room. If you have any questions, please feel free. If you want to raise your hand, just because of the way I have my Zoom set up, I can't see people if your camera's off, but if you have any questions, please feel free to use the raise your hand function. I'm happy to call on you. Kelly.
Hi, and great job for both of y'all. I know Denise is a fellow Gator of mine, so it's good to see you, and congratulations to Dr. Slaughter. I haven't seen you in a while either, so just it's great to see you. But my question is for Dr. Slaughter, and I want to think about your idea of millennials, right? So I really like this paper. And I know you were going through the years. I believe it started with 2008. So 2016 would be the first election that all the millennials within your frame would be considered active voters, right? So personally, I'm born in 96. So my first election was the 2016 Trump and Hillary election, right? So I wanted to ask you, have you thought about dividing these groups at all? Because now, they're called the geriatric millennials, those born in the late 80s. And how might this change the way that we think about the racial gap? And sort of also building off of Dr. Gillespie's question, is there a way for technology, especially things like social media, to play a role in how people are thinking or examining the racial wealth gap? And I guess that would be more of a qualitative process part. But thank y'all.
For your question. So you're right. So the outcomes that I examined are in 2008, but the millennials that I examined, they're between the ages of 18 to 36 in 2008. So it's not necessarily, so 1996 wouldn't have been included. It's just the folks that are at that floor, well, at the minimum threshold in 2008. So that's another thing to kind of consider is like, even though like Pew defines like generational cohorts as such, like where geriatric millennials haven't branched off from the, I guess, regular millennials. But when I included the age variable, even within individuals within the 18 to 36 like age bracket, we still see that age has a positive influence. So this is kind of leading us to believe that increased age within the millennial cohort may shift or factor into individuals' propensity to participate, but that's definitely something that's worth investigating. And then thinking about kind of how millennials are changing how folks participate, like in terms of like being more active on social media or doing other, or like running for office earlier or other things. That's something that I definitely think is factoring into rates of participation, but it's just, going back to Andra's point, like how do we capture that? Because the survey really isn't going to give me that granularity in terms of like how much people are participating. But it is something that is worthy of investigation. And I did see, not a plug for another panel, but there is like a few panels that are on millennials. And I think Donovan Watts has some work on that. And then I know Alex Davis, she had a paper. So just a lot of people are investigating millennials. So it might be worthwhile to see like the other aspects beyond political, like beyond like just voting.
Great, thank you for that question. Any other questions? So we got about 10 minutes, so we could probably.
I have a question for Denise.
Sure, go ahead.
Denise, I'm wondering how you think about like if the types of investment matter. So thinking about like kind of the businesses that are drawn to Georgia, like does it matter if it's a manufacturing business versus, let's say, like a Hollywood or like movie productions? Are you thinking about there's variation in like the types of businesses and corporations that are drawn to the state? Or are you just thinking through just generally more investments in the state should have these outcomes for Black Georgians?
So if we were to talk about just businesses, Christine, that'd be huge, be much, very big economic project, right? So the foreign direct investments, the research that Professor Figlio did that I'm building on, the good thing about it is that it's contained to foreign international firms that are locating here. And typically what research shows is that they pay more, they pay higher wages. Generally, it is found that they do contribute to income inequality. But I'm also thinking that there might be hiring disparities, there might be wage disparities across racial lines. So I'm very much interested in looking to see how much African Americans in Georgia are benefiting from these billions of dollars of foreign investments that are coming in. And that's different, actually, according to Professor Figlio's work. There are greater the advantages of a foreign multinational coming into Georgia are greater than a domestic firm relocating to Georgia. The benefits are great. So there is a difference between a domestic relocation and a foreign firm relocating to Georgia. They give hundreds of millions of dollars in tax incentives, free land. There's a controversy in Georgia right now about the hundreds of millions of dollars given to an EV parts manufacturer that's going to locate in Georgia. There's just a lot of money that's given to these foreign firms. And are the people benefiting from all of this is what we'd like to find out. The average worker, African Americans more specifically, are we benefiting from all of this?
Great, thank you very much for that question. We have time for 2 more questions. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'm happy to help you redeem your time. Just as a plug, the business meeting is going to be at 6:30. So I think you can check the conference proceedings for a link to be able to get there. I want to thank Denise and Christine for their great presentations. I want to thank the audience for being here. So I look forward to seeing you on another panel. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.